At this time, we'd like to welcome our next panel. We have a fabulous session on cyber. It's the topic that is very much certainly on the minds of board members across the C-suite and very much on the minds of these leaders here. So I'd like to introduce and welcome the next panel members. We have Robert Jett from RGA, Rachel Reed from Voya Financial, John Ridgey from the FBI, and of course, Mary Ellen Callahan from Jenner, who will be moderating the discussion today. So thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you all. As Kevin said, the cybersecurity and cyber threats really are at the forefront of all of our thoughts, and particularly when thinking about corporate compliance, corporate governance, and what to be worried about. And as you're going to hear today from this extraordinary group of panelists, in terms of the cyber threat, it's not necessarily if it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen. And so what I've asked these panelists to do is talk me through what should I be thinking about ahead of time, pre-breach. How do I deal with responding to a breach in an effective and efficient manner? What should I be thinking about after the breach? What do we be doing with this whole life cycle of data and response and cybersecurity threats? And I think that, obviously to set the stage, global businesses have extraordinary risk landscapes. They have globalized markets, fragmented supply chains, dynamic business models, mobile workforce, digitized information, all these different environments that have created an extraordinary opportunity, a really interdependent and integrated opportunity. With that said, that also has created an opportunity for risk and for threats. And what I'm going to first do is turn to my friend and colleague, John Ridgey, to talk about, first, how does this happen? What happens for companies? If you could kind of give us a little bit of a brief overview, what we should be thinking about, what are the threat landscapes, and who are the threat actors?
Sure. Thanks, Mary Ellen. It's great to be here. So first, to paint the picture of the threat landscape. So unfortunately, it is pretty treacherous these days. It's evolving very quickly. It's expanding. That's the bad news. The good news is there's tremendous awareness, both in government and private sector, and awareness that we have to work together to defend against this threat. Because the reality is that a vast majority of the intelligence and evidence related to the cyber threat lies on private networks. It lies on your networks, which the government does not have access to, contrary to what Eric Snowden has misled the country to believe. We don't see it. We need your help. We often have intelligence and investigative information, pieces of the puzzle, clues, which when compared to the information on your networks, the adversary's tactics and techniques and procedures, as we say, we put those pieces of the puzzle together and we understand and we get a clear picture of the adversary, who they are. So let me talk to you a little bit about the adversary. Who are they? Most companies and businesses in the United States face two primary adversaries. One is criminal organizations. And criminal organizations are mainly financially motivated. They're seeking to steal your data or your funds, which they can monetize, either on the dark web or through direct wire transfers, for instance, if you are a financial institution. The criminal organizations understand that your intellectual property, your proprietary information, is of value to them as well, which can be sold or traded to others who have an interest, either competitors or even to nation states. They're also after bulk PII, personally identifiable information, PCI, personal credit information, and in the context of the healthcare, they're certainly after personal health information. Each of those data sets can be monetized by criminal actors, by the bad guys. And this information is openly sold and traded on the dark web. We see it all the time. And some of the more advanced companies actually have threat intelligence units which monitor the dark web to see if their information is actually out there or if their company is being mentioned in some of the criminal forums that are out there. Another trend that we're seeing quite recently that really deserves mention and special attention to are business email compromise situations. Basically, senior officials or those with fiduciary authority inside your organization, their emails are specifically targeted for intrusion by an actor. Once they're in your, let's say your CFO's email, they monitor, they conduct surveillance of the type of dialogues that are going on there and understanding certain transactions that are about to take place which may require a transfer, a wire transfer of funds. They simply insert an email, which appears to be coming, in fact, it is coming from your CFO's account, to the wiring authority to the institution. In reference to XYZ transaction, this is the account to send the funds to. And the average dollar loss now that we're seeing is $50,000. I've seen one as high as $100 million. This was in the past 6 months. Most of those funds are going over to Southeast Asia, and believe it or not, the second highest destination of these funds is Canada. Now, the government as a whole, again, working with private sector, we've been able to implement some procedures to recall those wires. Wire transfers, there's about a 72-hour period. If we're alerted quickly and the victim is aware, we have about 72 hours working with financial authorities and the banks to recall the wire. And believe it or not, we've actually had some success recalling wire transfers from China. So for the bad guys there, this is a very high return, high profit, and very low risk scheme. The other issue we're seeing with criminal organizations these days involve extortion and ransomware. So what happens is, in these type of situations, adversaries intruded on your network, exfiltrated sensitive data from the company, and they basically extort the company. We say, we have your data, we're about to release it. They show proof, unless you pay us anywhere from a few $1,000s or $1 million. Now, you can imagine if you're let's say, a law firm that specializes in cybersecurity.
Hey, wait a second.
And and this is how
Don't get any ideas.
and you portray yourself to your clients as being safe and secure and experts. Imagine how much damage that would do to your firm and your reputation if that was leaked. So unfortunately, when those situations happen, the victim is left with very few options. But we always recommend you contact the FBI because we might be able to help identify who the perpetrator is and perhaps even block it. But and the other issue is ransomware, where the adversary, the cyber adversary, criminal group, delivers malware into your system that executes and basically locks all your files, totally encrypted. And you can't access them. And the government can't access them. The encryption is so strong, even the government can't break it. So unfortunately, in those type of situations, prevention is certainly the best recourse there. And having what we call off-network backups, out-of-band type backups of that data, which is not not connected to your network.
John, are you seeing terrorist activities online as well?
We are. So I'll just finish on the criminal side because I want to make a point there that the Bitcoin, the ransom payments are usually done in Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. Very difficult for us to trace because the subjects are overseas. So in terms of like nation state, but I'll jump over to the terrorist activity online. We do see an intent by terrorist organizations to conduct computer intrusions. Yes, certainly they would have the intent to disrupt, especially our critical infrastructure, such as the energy grid, so forth, but fortunately they have demonstrated very low capability to do so in terms of, generally it's ISIS that we're most concerned about. There's some other terrorist organizations out there that are state-backed, perhaps like Hezbollah and Hamas, per public information would have perhaps greater capability, but they don't have the intent to attack the United States. So ISIS and groups such as that, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, generally we've seen their activity related to some minor web defacements and attempting some denial of service attacks right now. The other major adversary that you would really face, most companies would face, are nation-state sponsored cyber attacks. So now I can publicly say it, it's Russia, China, Iran, what we all knew anyways, but I can publicly say it since D&I Clapper said it. They're the ones that are after your intellectual property. They're the ones who want to seek either economic or strategic or national security advantage by stealing your information. Again, why spend billions and billions of dollars on research and development when they can simply steal what's already been done in those areas there? Big increase there. It's continuing. Strategic threat facing the United States and companies. And again, I would say, again, for you all to be aware of, we see these adversaries targeting the law firms, which would have the sensitive proprietary information representing large corporations on mergers and acquisitions, or again, just representing them when they're dealing with one of these adversary nations. So the companies, the big corporations have hardened their defenses, but often, or sometimes, the law firm, which may have the same information security may be secondary thought. So just, again, something to think about there.
It's a pretty sobering thought. Sorry about that.
Sorry for the gloom and doom, folks.
I know, but it's important to know what's out there. It's important to know what's out there. So, Rachel, John talked about advanced persistent state-sponsored threats, criminals, but it could be that the biggest threat may lie within the systems, within your organization itself. It could be employees, contractors, law firms, as John said, who either made a mistake or actually have been recruited. Can you talk about things to think about with regard to the so-called insider threat and what kind of policies and procedures to establish for that?
Absolutely. So for in-house lawyers and compliance professionals, with all the nefarious characters that John was describing, statistically speaking, I think your biggest threat comes from your own employees and contractors who you actually issue credentials to access your systems and your sensitive information. So that's what we spend most of our time worrying about and trying to protect against. You really have two categories of insider threats. One are sort of the malicious actors. So some of the criminals John was mentioning could gain employment at one of your companies, or they could be in financial distress or have other outside factors that cause them to try to take some of the actions that criminals and nation states and hacktivists will take on your systems. The best thing you can do to protect against that is to really work with your IT staff and make sure that your security profile is addressing both the external threats and the internal threats. I think a lot of companies, particularly if you're a little bit less mature in your IT security program, you're focused on your perimeter defenses, locking the front door. But you need to think about, once you've unlocked the front door and let people in, do you have the right logging capabilities, system monitoring, access controls, so you can see what authorized users are doing inside your network? Are you looking for patterns? Are you looking for gaps? That's critically important to make sure that your assets are protected. The other biggest threat, I think, for most of us, and particularly in an ethics and compliance context, we would certainly hope that most of our insider threats are in the second category. It's the innocent mistakes. It's human errors. It's people mixing up files, being careless with their credentials, leaving things out in the open, being polite and holding the door open for someone who's carrying a bunch of boxes, coming into the company behind you. Those types of things can lead to as many data breaches and cyber breaches as these hacktivists and bad actors. And to treat the second problem, it's all about training and awareness. It's really building, as much as we've talked in this conference about building a culture of compliance, you need to build a culture of awareness and sensitivity when it comes to data security and privacy issues. So just the same as someone thinks about being polite for their colleague and holding the door, at the same time they're being very security conscious and aware, and they're asking for credentials and who are you and where are you going, as well as being extremely careful in their daily tasks in order to protect your company data.
Bob, how is your organization dealing with the threats that John talked about? And in particular, can you talk about kind of the international aspect associated with the cyber threats and compliance issues?
Thanks. It is tough. I'll follow on to Rachel's. I mean, the key for us has been education and awareness and getting people to know that there are people within the organization who do care about this. So we've done road trips where I'll go out with the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. We'll do a combined presentation. We'll weave in, we'll talk about this later, but we'll weave in compliance and then really try to talk about this as business conduct. This is how we want you to conduct business, and then we try to lead up to that. It does translate well. People see that there's, we try to present a united front, so they're not getting one message from one side of the company and a different message from the other side of the company. We try to integrate the messages that the IT folks day-to-day are doing with the compliance and the information security operations, so that, again, you get that singular voice, that orchestra that sounds well in tune about what do we consider to be issues. And the challenge, I think, is you've got different best practices for different organizations depending upon your industry. So, we don't have a PCI issue because we don't collect credit information in my business, as an example. Other businesses have PCI issues. So you do have to tailor some of your approaches to your industry and what the best practices are. Some of the things that we found to be very successful is we instituted a policy and then backed it up with a process that any data that leaves the network requires us to perform due diligence on where that data is going. So, and if you get caught with a policy violation, you're going to get written up. It sounds like, Joe Cop, and don't mean to be Joe Cop, but you've got to have some level of enforcement to say, we take this seriously, it's important, and the due diligence has really helped us to identify the data flow. Where is that data going, and do we know where it's going and why? Just one comment to follow on to John's specific ones. One of the things that we've done, and I know other organizations I've talked with some peers have done, is we now do active phishing simulations. So we sent out a nice email from our executive team and said, we are going to phish you. And I admit myself, I have been captured. And I clicked on one. But what we've done is use it as an opportunity to teach and educate. So if you do mistakenly click on it, you get a little pop-up that says, you've been phished.
Yeah.
And then you have to immediately take the training. Basically, we locked them out of their system.
So it's ransomware is your own computer in order to make you be a better. Okay, got it.
But it's been very
Yeah.
successful for us in terms of reducing
So
that
these
threat.
phishing exercises that Bob's talking about, a lot of companies are doing it. And just for your information, in my experience with my clients, somewhere between 28 and 33% of the people targeted click on the link. So if you are like Bob and had clicked on the link, and remember, this is off-the-record conversation, so no one can say that about Bob, otherwise he needs a new job. But it is important to know that there is going to be that 28% to 33% regardless. I've seen some as high as 50%. But it is a good, useful tool and an exercise to help train individuals.
It is.
One of the things we're talking about here is information, and that there's so much information out there. And part of the problem may be, what are the crown jewels, the intellectual property that the advanced, persistent, state-sponsor threats may be interested in getting it. And Rachel, if I can just ask you to talk a little bit about how should companies think about prioritizing their crown jewels, and how can you identify them and make sure that they're protected or more protected, given John's threat landscape?
Absolutely. So protecting your infrastructure is a little bit like boiling the ocean, right? There's only so much you can do. You need to take reasonable steps. And you need to start by identifying your crown jewels. What are your most important information assets? And that's going to be different for every company. Identifying them is really as simple as a brainstorming exercise. Talk to your executives, talk to your senior management. Is your most important asset your customer data? Do you have a lot of personally identifiable information? If you're a software company, it could be your intellectual property, your software code. So think through what data, what information do you possess that's of value to your company. The second step, which is the much trickier one, is figuring out where that data is stored. So if any of you have undertaken a data mapping exercise, congratulations on still being here today. It is a daunting task, but I would encourage you to start. A partial data mapping is much more valuable than no data mapping. So start with the obvious. Start with your record-keeping systems, your administrative systems, your big systems. Start with your key vendor partners. Do you have data in the cloud? Do you partner with Microsoft and Amazon to use the cloud? Use the Salesforce cloud for your customer data. Find sort of the most obvious places where your data is stored, document it, and keep it updated. And then if you're lucky enough or persistent enough, I'll say, to get that far, go beyond it. Do you have share drives? Do you allow employees to use SharePoint sites? You can have structured and unstructured data all over your environment. And there have been a number of cases where I've talked to chief data officers and others at companies who have been victims of cyber attacks, and they spent months and months figuring out what data was compromised. because they didn't have a comprehensive data mapping. So we'll go into later all of the chaos you're dealing with in the middle of a breach, and you don't even know what data was compromised because you don't know what particular data was in that system. So if you haven't, it sounds basic, but you absolutely need to start, what are your crown jewels, and then where are they? And document it as comprehensively as you can.
Thanks, Rachel. So Bob, with you as the Global Compliance Counsel and Data Privacy Officer, you've got a lot of stuff on your plate. You have a lot of different priorities. How do you balance that? And who else in the organization is involved prior to a breach? We're almost at the breach stage, but prior to that, who else would you get involved to work with?
I mean, basically, one of the things that I've tried to do is to drive it down to the employee level, because you've always got the C-suite on your side for the most part. There's always going to be education and awareness there, but we try to drive it down, and by that's hard to do, I know, but we will do, food is an amazing thing, food and liquor.
They are both amazing things. That is a correct statement, and that's on the record.
Great tools, great tools. So we actually do a full month. We do an information security, and this year we changed it to Cyber Awareness Month. We take an entire month. It is a global event. It's a global month, and we do different things, and we will create virtual presence for executives that cannot be there in person, but we will send executives out to some of the larger offices. In fairness, we don't go to all the small offices, but we do invite them to come to some of the larger offices. But the idea is get people there, let them know that this is a company-wide thing we're doing, make it fun. One of the things we've done with the help of the FBI and some other local law enforcement is bring and say, all right, well, now we're talking about what happens at work. Let's tell you why this is important for your family, why your kids shouldn't use the iPad that we give you at the office, and things like that. So we try to personalize the message, and that's been very successful. Those sessions are booked, standing room only, when we have those people come in, and you try to make it personal to them. It's just not about the company, it's about what you do personally. The key is, again, I overplay it, but the orchestra is really key, is that the message gets lost if it's not strong and with the same cadence throughout the organization. So we try to really focus on, am I saying the same things that the CISO is saying? Am I saying the same things that our CIO is saying? Are we carrying the message through properly to try to make sure we understand it? There's a lot of loss in translation that happens too, as we talk differently. Different cultures are challenging. The Asian cultures in particular are very challenging. There's a lot of very black and white understanding of, well, it says I should do this, I have to do this, and we're not saying you shouldn't do that. We're just saying give us a chance to understand what it is you're going to do before you do it. And so part of that is just trying to let them know that we're not at all challenging their right and their obligation to do it. We just want to understand what to do. And then to answer the question fully is, I pull in local legal counsel, I pull in the local management. Again, the cyber awareness or the information security awareness month is fantastic for that. It really does get everybody on board, and we make it, we send cupcakes and we offer, for those areas that allow it, we'll buy everybody a drink at the end of the day.
So John, I'd be interested in your thoughts about some of this pre-breach activity they're talking about. But one of the questions that my clients always ask is, right, how could I miss it for this long? There's this lag that's built into the system. They say maybe even as much as 270 days from the first penetration to the discovery of a breach. If you can speak to that, why is that, and how can companies help reduce that,
Sure.
that difference?
So there's several reasons. Really, there's probably three main top reasons. And, cybersecurity it varies as a priority across companies. Sometimes certain companies just don't address it as a priority or devote sufficient resources in understanding the threat, the nature of the threat. And so it may take a while before their information security department actually detects the threat. They may be understaffed, under-resourced, but I don't want to blame the victim. The next two reasons are really more important on why these threats are not detected. First is the sophistication of the malware. This malware, whether it's criminally originated or from a nation state, is very, very sophisticated to the point where it can be programmed to mutate once it's inside your system, or be communicating externally to a controller who will recognize that, in fact, the malware has been detected, and that will order it, instruct it to mutate to a different variant which may not be detected from the signature, the original signature of the malware. Very, very sophisticated. The phishing campaigns that Bob mentioned earlier, these phishing campaigns are highly, highly targeted and crafted these days. One thing I want to mention is you should be very, very conscious of the social media profile of yourselves and your top executives, because that's what the adversaries are doing. The first place they'll go to design a targeted spearfish email is on your social media profile. They'll understand what university you went to, perhaps where your kids go to school, and then an email comes in, appears to be a fundraiser from your university, from your alma mater, from your fraternity, in understanding perhaps, again, what your likes or dislikes, interests. So highly crafted, very difficult to detect as a spearfish email. So the malware, as I said, once it's delivered, mutates, propagates, almost like a biological virus would, mutating constantly, changing signature. The next reason, really is probably one of the biggest reasons, and the government has this same issue, is it's hard to detect what's abnormal when you don't know what normal is. In other words, the networks have not been baseline. In a lot of these networks, the institutions do not understand that certain data or certain encrypted data should not be traveling over a certain port at a certain time, or there is not sufficient log analysis. And to Rachel's great point about data mapping, so the data mapping, extremely important, and then the network topography. Where is all the network, the hardware, so forth, the servers located? It's amazing that sometimes an institution will find the servers actually outside the firewall and had never been updated. Another reason is the adversary, again, to the sophistication, will identify zero-day vulnerabilities, which can actually be purchased on the dark web. So no one's aware that the firmware in my server has an exploit, has a vulnerability in it, and the bad guys have designed the malware to take advantage of that and to use that as a vector inside the network and then propagate throughout.
So I started this panel saying that it's a question of when, not if, we're going to have a breach or a cyber incident. We're at that stage now. It's when, it's now. And so our hypothetical company up here has been attacked. Crown jewels have been leaked, and some detailed financial information, including future projections, has been exfiltrated. So Bob, I'm going to turn to you. Yeah. Is this a breach? And if so, what are the most important steps that your team and your board should expect in the first 48 hours?
The first thing I respond is, don't use the word breach. The word breach is now a term of art in certain statutes and regulations, and it's almost an admission. As soon as that email goes out from somebody to say, we've had a data breach, you may have already set in motion notice requirements and things that you have to do. So one best practice I could leave you with is, it's an incident, and that's what I usually, and we talk internally about that, and it's a security incident until we verify that there's been a breach. So the first thing is, let's talk about it as a security incident. I usually say it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle once you've said breach, because everybody just focuses on, this is, have a plan. Start to think now what your plan is going to look like. Depending upon your industry and your organization, you're going to want to have somebody you can dial up immediately to help you do the forensic analysis. Where did they really exfiltrate financial information? As John pointed out, they typically are going to prove, you're going to have some proof and some verification. I really try to communicate and coordinate are really the two bywords that I say, which is, let's all make sure we've got the same message, we've all got the same information, let's coordinate our responses. You're going to need to have clear lines of communication and responsibility, and your plan should recognize that. You should have an outside counsel. You should have maybe template PR materials prepared so that you can issue a statement right away saying, we're investigating this, or we've heard this, we're going to look at that. So I guess communication, coordination, and a plan that you can follow. I want to talk more about that later. The other thing not to forget that's really key is your internal communications. That's probably the second most important thing. It's really important because you're also going to have client-facing employees internally that may feel that they have to contact the clients and say things, and you want to coordinate that message as well. So the internal communications, I would argue, are almost as important, if not more important, than the external communications. Again, getting back to, you want everybody to be speaking with the same voice, to have the same information and the same materials.
So about the internal team,
Yeah.
Rachel, how does one structure it? How do you get the chief compliance officer, the chief privacy officer, the general counsel, the CISO, everybody? How do you get all you guys working together and mitigating the loss of information and how to handle a response?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that popped into my mind when you said, okay, there's been an incident, what do you do is pull out your cybersecurity playbook. And hopefully it's not dusty and it's up to date and in good shape and it's been regularly practiced and exercised. And I'm just curious, I'm always curious, quick show of hands, how many of your companies have a cybersecurity playbook? How many practice it regularly? Okay, for those that didn't put your hand in the air, I highly recommend that one of your takeaways to go back, pull together a cross-functional team with your CISO, your GC or representative from the law department, your chief privacy officer, someone from compliance, someone from communications, someone from the business and operations, someone from risk, and a few other folks I'm probably forgetting right now, and put together a comprehensive cybersecurity response playbook. I think to not do so is I was trying to think of an analogy earlier, and the only thing I could come up with is like taking 11 people, handing them a football, okay, putting them out there on the field, not telling which position they're playing. You don't know who's the quarterback, you don't know who's the wide receiver, you don't know who's the center and who's the lineman, and then putting the New York Giants on the opposite side of the field and wishing them good luck.
Well, the Giants, it might be okay. Sorry.
I agree.
We're in New York.
Being from New England.
So it's not going to go well, right? And it is absolutely critical, to Bob's point, to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities when you're in the midst of investigating a cybersecurity incident. There were many lessons learned from a lot of the large, highly publicized data breaches over the past couple of years. I think for me, the one that hit home the most was you do not want to go public with inaccurate information. There are a few things that can do more damage to your company's reputation than going public with a statement that something really terrible happened and then having to come back 2 weeks later and say, actually, it was even worse than we originally told you. So you need to make sure what you're communicating to all of these numerous stakeholders and constituents, the press, your customers, your employees, to Bob's point. You may be notifying any number of different regulators, government agencies, attorneys generals. Make sure your message is accurate and it's consistent through all of this. And the only way to do that is if you have a centralized person coordinating the response. At Voya, we call that an incident commander. And as soon as we invoke the cybersecurity playbook, there's an incident commander assigned, and they are the puppet master. And then everybody under the playbook has their assigned role and responsibility. Who's going to be responsible for updating the board and the executive committee? Who is responsible for preparing the communications to the press? Who's responsible for engaging the PR firms that you've already identified in your playbook as who you're going to go to? Who's responsible for calling the outside counsel who you've already identified in your playbook, as well as the forensic and cybersecurity experts who you may need to assist you? You need someone from risk management, because hopefully you have cyber insurance and you need to make sure you're very timely in notifying your cyber insurance carriers. And again, all of those people, you want to be receiving the same message with timely and accurate information. Everybody has a role to play. I can't think of another task within the company that really involves so many stakeholders, both inside and external to the company, where you need them coordinated in such sort of a perfect fashion for it to go smoothly. So that's why you've got to write it down and you've got to practice it regularly.
So that's at least a takeaway for today. Another thing to highlight on this is to make sure that those of you who are general counsels or are attorneys, that the activities that you're doing, the investigations and so on, is protected under attorney-client privilege, including in anticipation for litigation, and that you can try to protect the information. And you know, speaking of large breaches, Target actually did a very good job of protecting the investigation portion of the forensics. They had kind of two separate teams, that one that was just doing the investigation, the other one was doing the remediation, and that they had a series of court decisions that held that their investigation itself was protected under privilege. So that's an important takeaway as you develop these interdisciplinary teams that Rachel spoke to.
Just one quick to the general counsel point too is that, and we've probably all seen this, is if you are the general counsel, start to engage and train people on your team that are going to be able to, because as general counsel, you're going to have 15 things in that plan that you're going to have to do. You cannot do them all. I mean, depending upon your role in the company. So one thing we've learned is, you know, start to delegate right away in the plan, have those people trained or go to seminars so that they know what to do, because when it does happen, you're just not going to be able to carry all the water yourself.
You know,
So, John.
I just had a point on that, on the excellent points that both Bob and Rachel made about having a plan. That plan should include on a decision or a discussion on whether you would contact law enforcement.
When would you do that, John?
All right, so your plan should include contact with law enforcement. That decision should be made prior to you having an incident. If you will contact and how you will contact law enforcement. And hopefully who. Hopefully you already have a relationship with someone that the local FBI office, where your headquarters is situated. So when that should happen, it should happen immediately. Of course, from our perspective, the sooner we can get there and help you, and that's the point, to help you contain and mitigate, because that's part of our investigative process, the less damage that will be done. And electronic evidence is very, it dissipates very quickly, potentially. Just as witness memory could fade, incidents, evidence, and intelligence related to cybercrime can immediately fade and dissipate. Actually, the adversary may be able to destroy the evidence remotely. So the longer you wait, the more difficult our job becomes in helping identify the adversary and, again, helping prevent future attacks. So one of the main reasons to call the government, the FBI specifically, is that if you're the victim of, again, a cyber intrusion, we treat you as a victim first. We're not there to lay blame. We're not regulators. Much of my regulator colleagues grimace when I say that. And our role is not to call the regulator or to find some type of civil blame or malfeasance. That's not our role. It's to conduct an investigation, whether it's criminal or national security. The decision on what to report to the regulator, we leave that to you, your general counsel's office, and your regulator. Most importantly, we're able to bring in a lot of resources. Depending upon the level of your breach, we have multi-tiered response plans where we would deploy local resources, again, computer scientists from the local field office, and if it is a very sophisticated breach, we may deploy folks from our national assets at headquarters, highly skilled and experienced computer scientists. And that's the point, is that we've seen this a lot. We have very experienced people that may have dealt specifically with a type of malware that's on your system and may understand how to mitigate and contain that. And also, we can leverage resources from across government. If it is a national security matter, we think this is an advanced persistent threat, we will leverage our colleagues at NSA and CIA to understand what the intent and capability of the adversary is, understand perhaps they have a technical remediation, and help us disrupt the adversary either through criminal prosecution or some joint intelligence operation. And to your point about communications, the FBI's response has evolved. We understand, especially after Sony, we have to provide more than a technical response. In fact, we call this the Sony model. We know that victim companies have to address a myriad of legal issues. So along a major breach, along with our technical folks, we'll send our lawyers too, and folks from Department of Justice to help the victim company navigate through these legal issues. We'll send communications folks out to help manage those internal communications, external communications, making certain that any public statements by the government and the company are synchronized and are in line. And again, because we understood that was a major issue for these companies, and we certainly don't want to discourage cooperation. In the case of Sony, individual employees of the company were victimized. their PII was stolen. It was obviously embarrassing emails that were leaked, but they had to alert their credit bureaus and so forth. We provided victim witness folks out there to help those employees manage that and deal with the police departments on those issues. So again, our philosophy is to treat the company as a victim. We're not looking to lay blame. But on the regulator issue, there have been cases that we've actually been able to, I don't want to say intercede, but help manage that regulatory obligation. Because there's an ongoing criminal investigation, we've been able to convince the regulator to hold off on any public action because it may jeopardize the investigation.
Well, in fact, many of the state data breach notification laws, which are related to kind of sensitive personal data being compromised, have an exception that you can delay notifying the affected individuals if law enforcement investigation is ongoing, and that can be a helpful thing to know whether or not should we hold up or should we wait. Obviously, Sony didn't have that benefit,
right.
But if it is an investigation that,
in fact, the Federal Trade Commission, working with DOJ, has basically issued a policy that the FTC at least would look favorably upon cooperation with law enforcement. And,
in responding to a breach.
In responding to a breach, yes, and notifying us.
Okay, so we now have had this breach. We've initiated the team that Rachel had been exercising and testing. We've gone through all the steps that Bob talked about. We've worked together. We've reached out to John. We've dealt with all these things. Now we've had a little bit of time to reflect, to go and say, okay, we've sent out the notices. We had a variety of different responses. And particularly again the global aspect of it all. I'd love you guys to think a little bit about looking back at this. So Rachel, starting with you, in terms of dealing with this in information security and cybersecurity, are companies looking at that in a systemic way? Are there policies? Are there ways that people can improve the cybersecurity opportunity? And is cybersecurity risk management the same as any other risk management that companies have to look at or address?
I think it is and it isn't. One thing we know for sure now is that cybersecurity is no longer an IT issue. It's a cross-functional business, legal, compliance, and board issue. So everyone should be interested and everyone should be participating. I think what makes cyber a little bit different is the constantly evolving landscape. So the same way you may skim over your insider trading policy once a year and find, you can change will to shall or update something, here or there, your cyber is going to be constantly changing. It may change before you even realize it's changed, and you could be updating your cyber response plan weekly or monthly as opposed to annually. So I think you need to go about it strategically, but you also need to be very agile and ready to shift and adjust and adapt and make changes sort of as things arise. A couple of things we do at Voya that I think are particularly helpful is that we do have a subcommittee assigned. We call it the IT Risk Subcommittee, and it looks at cyber issues regularly. Everything from IT security's roadmap for projects they're working on to evolving threat landscape and things of that nature. So again, that's done systemically and strategically and at the right cross-functional level, again, while trying to be agile as things change over time.
Do I have a question right here? We're going to switch out our mic? Okay, good, because I'm like watching this. You're fading in and out, Rachel, not in substance, but in sound. So while we're switching out Rachel's mic, that's great timing. Bob, I'd love your thoughts on the same question, but also in terms of building repeatable processes that companies should be thinking about in order to work on this.
Right, and so the follow-on our discussions here, Rachel talked about, you've got these wonderful things that you do as a part of your ethical conduct program and your overall compliance program, which is training and awareness. Start to incorporate part of your ethical business conduct is we want to do business ethically. Well, that includes making sure that we're aware of cybercrime, things that are happening, threats, report threats. If you see something, I guess the best way to say it is you need to create a speak up culture. It sounds kind of cliche, but it's really not intended to be a cliche. You want people to raise their hand. You want And I tell them, you can do anything you want. If you want to email me, if you want to call the hotline, if you want to send an email to the CEO. But the point is, we want you to speak up and say, hey, I've noticed that this isn't right. I got a weird email from the CFO. The CFO never emails me. That's great. Thank you for that. We're going to look at that. That could be, part of a phishing attack or a spear phishing attack. All of this is going to be helpful. So the repeatable processes, again, you can't overtrain, I don't think, on these issues. We've started to integrate with our overall compliance and ethical business training. We've updated our acceptable use policies. We don't want to really bleed people to death on the training, but you do want to keep it in front of them. I mean, that's the key. And so however creative you want to do that, we've done music videos. We've just gotten as creative out of the box as we possibly can to kind of get the message out there so that it's fresh and different. And as Rachel mentioned, you've got records management. Part of I think one area that we're starting to focus on now, and I know some other companies are as well, is how do I start to look at nipping the problem of structured versus unstructured data at the beginning, at the origin of the data. So when the document's created, can I put rules around the meta tag that you're going to put on that, and who should have permission to see the document? So I'm asking you up front, you created this document, who should see it, why should they see it, and how long should we keep it? And so you're sort of hitting three really important things from a compliance perspective as well as a cyber perspective right at the beginning. Very tough to do and do well. I mean, it's a fast-moving culture, and the information is needed out there. The other one that I've seen recently, just one other takeaway, is that you'll start to see now in a lot of the help desk in your IT areas that access management is becoming sort of a separate unit, that there is a full-on focus and a large team that deals only with what access does an individual have and why do they have that access. The other one we've done recently, which I think is a really good one, is coordinating with HR so that when someone shifts their role in the company, there's an automatic flag to the old manager to coordinate with the new manager to say, okay, this person's moving from the finance area to the operations area. What accesses do they have? We understand they're going to need to train or transition business, but let's come up with a plan so that once they've trained their replacement or the transitions occurred, their access is terminated. And a lot of times, we can all probably admit, it doesn't happen as well as you, and that's just getting back to the access management. So there's a lot of process improvements and training that can be done to sort of help you along the way.
The rules and roles-based access that Bob just spoke about, and Rachel, you touched a little bit on, how active are you guys in kind of setting that up as chief compliance and or privacy officers? Is that something that you help design the system? Do you make the decisions? Is that something that other people should be thinking about in terms of a compliance regime?
I volunteered with it. Compliance, I heard some in the earlier sessions, I think compliance gets a bad rap because they see compliance coming and they run the other way. If I go in and I coordinate with a cross-function, if I go in with HR, if I go with IT, and it's not seen as a compliance-driven requirement, but it's try to get the business people involved, it's a much easier sell. So I usually try to create a joint effort. The one with the role changes was just in talking with HR, we had a lot of issues with people that were moving as departments were being rearranged and reorged, and we wanted to accommodate the transition and the training, but we also wanted to make sure that we weren't allowing access to be given to people that didn't need to have access.
How about you, Rachel?
We partner as well closely with IT. So again, this is something that was historically an IT responsibility, and I don't think as lawyers and compliance professionals we can allow that. And I think it's unfair to IT to put the entire onus on them for such an important task. So I'm not going out and determining which software or product we're going to use, to manage our credentials or things of that nature. But I do want to sit down. I want to read through the policy before it's published. I want to understand sort of the risk profile created by the policy. I'm going to ask a lot of questions about it. I'm going to ask what alternatives there were, why we selected this one. Are there future plans to move, to another solution in the future? And make sure you understand, because I think as lawyers and compliance professionals, we just think about these things a little bit differently. than IT people do. And although our goals and objectives at a very high level are aligned, I think at a more granular level, the tasks that each of us have been charged with are very different. So I think in order to have the right outcome, you need both the IT access management team as well as your law and compliance professionals participating in that activity.
Great. John, there's a saying of never let a good crisis go to waste. Are companies learning from these breaches? We've talked about a couple of the big headliner ones, but are companies learning? Are they changing behaviors? What lessons are we not learning yet?
So they are learning. I mean, I've just seen in the 2 years that I've been there in cyber division, the level of interest that's being generated. It's hard to ignore these problems, right? The daily barrage of headlines where the cyber adversaries, it's going after private companies and the government. So tremendous awareness where we would have to be proactively going out to carry our message to private sector. They're proactively coming to us, which is a great sign. And they're understanding that these risks generated by the cyber adversaries could end up being an existential risk to the company in terms of reputational harm, shareholder value, civil liability, regulatory liability. So we've seen a great deal of interest. And we understand that there's far more resources being devoted to information security within a lot of organizations. We've also seen an alignment structure within certain organizations where information security no longer reports to information technology. Some view that as a potential conflict of interest. IT folks want to push out information, make information easy, accessible, let's make it speedy. Information security folks want to protect and hold. So we have seen an alignment, companies telling us we're putting information security under risk or compliance.
I've seen it under the GC as well. Yeah.
So there are still some companies out there, I think, that believe it's somebody else's problem, that they're too small, perhaps, to be attacked. And some of the bigger companies believe, perhaps at the board level, that, look, we've built a great big firewall, and we're good, not understanding there is no eliminating the cyber risk. Even for the federal government, we can manage that risk, but we're not impenetrable. And I think that awareness is coming across now. Certain sectors like financial services, healthcare, energy, defense are more progressive, more mature at protecting data, so they've come a long way. And we're hoping that rising tide will bring along the other sectors as well.
Are there ways companies can help you guys, the FBI, the federal government, in terms of what they're seeing?
Absolutely. I mean, it comes down to information sharing. So as I've tried to stress here, the cyber threat is not unique to private sector, it's not unique to government. We are both in this together. We used to talk about a whole of government approach to address threats such as counterterrorism or drug trafficking. Clearly, when it comes to the cyber threat, this has to be a whole of nation approach. It's the same adversaries targeting your networks are targeting ours. So to share information with the government, to first share within your sector, share within your company, as mentioned by Rachel, cross-functional type issues, but share information with the government. And I think this is going to be a collective solution.
Great. I mean, we've had a lot of information today. We've covered a lot of topics. I mean, we went through an entire breach, and we're still standing. But what I'm going to ask my colleagues here on the panel to do is, what's the one or two things that you want everyone in this room to have as a takeaway? And I'll start with you, Bob. What's the takeaway we should have from this panel today?
I think Rachel and I both talked about it. I mean, the biggest takeaway that I would leave with is have a plan. It's really important. If you don't have a plan, one of the easy ways you can go get yourself started is go to your people that are doing your crisis management and your disaster recovery operations. They have a plan. Pull them in. They will help kickstart your plan. I mean, they are going to be stakeholders, obviously, in your ultimate plan. But and when you get to the final stage, we actually now have joint exercises, because you could argue that a data breach is a crisis, and it's a different type of crisis. But we actually have joint exercises where we will run a simulation where there's a data incident, and also there's a crisis going on at the same time, just to really, stress test the environment and stress test the plan to say, we'll do it across, multiple time zones. So you can get very creative and you can really stress test and make sure that the plan is going to be operative for your particular organization.
Rachel, what's your takeaways?
Actually, two things. First, I want to tack on to what John finished up with on the information sharing. So Voya very actively participates in the FSISAC, which is the Financial Services Information Sharing Network. We have found it extremely helpful and productive. So for those of you that haven't considered it, I would recommend looking into either your industry information sharing consortium or the government ones, and also the new, I believe it is called the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act legislation. Take a read through it. I actually found it very reasonable. I know as lawyers and compliance professionals, the idea of voluntarily sharing anything with the government sounds like a terrible idea, but there are really a lot of good benefit that can come from this bill. And again, I think the way the system is proposed to be set up is very reasonable and provides very adequate protections for companies who choose to engage in that. So I would recommend you take a look at that. My final takeaway is again, for lawyers and compliance people who don't have technology backgrounds, a lot of this can seem very daunting. Don't be fooled into thinking that you actually have to be tech savvy to be useful in this space. You'll have to learn some new acronyms, but you don't need to learn how to update the software on your own computer. You don't need to be able to read or program code. I think you all will bring skill sets with you from your legal and compliance and executive backgrounds that will be very valuable to this process, so don't be afraid to insert yourself in it. It's easy to learn, and again, I think your insights will be valuable to your companies.
John, what's the FBI's takeaway, or what's your takeaway?
Well, capitalizing on what's already said, great to have that plan, but again, incorporate contact with law enforcement, with the FBI into that plan. And very important, know who you're going to call, and hopefully you'll have a pre-existing, trusted personal relationship with whoever you're going to call, so you know exactly what the response is going to be. And so I would highly encourage that, both at the local level and even at the national level. If you do find yourself in an incident and you don't know who to call, I'm just going to give you a 24/7 phone number for our Cyber Watch Center and an email. But this number here, 855-292-3937. That's the FBI's 24/7 Cyber Watch.
Operators are standing by.
Operators standing now. You don't even have to pay for the call. And just call them, let them know where you're located. We'll get a response out to you. Now, we may not have a response on every incident, but if it's a major incident, you actually have an intrusion and exfiltration of data, you will have some response. So again, appreciate all you're doing, because the fact that you're here, interested in defending your networks, helps us defend the nation. So thank you very much.
Great. On that note, thank you all very much. Thank my panelists for a spectacular session.